The night sky over Texas was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel the world's holding its breath. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the soft hum of a windmill turned in the distance. The only light came from the porch of a small ranch house sitting on a patch of dry land, where a man named Marcus Lee leaned against the railing with a cup of coffee in his hand. His eyes were calm, but behind them sat the weight of someone who'd lived through too much. The ranch wasn't just his home, it was everything he had left from his father, from the years of hard work, and from a promise he made long ago never to run again. Inside, the faint sound of country music played from an old radio. The horses were already asleep in the stable, and the smell of hay and dust filled the night air. For Marcus, life had finally started to feel normal again. No chaos, no fighting, just the peace of land and sweat. But peace doesn't last long when the world decides you've had enough of it. Down the dirt road, a trail of headlights appeared. 4 trucks. No plates, dark windows, engines humming like thunder. Marcus noticed them right away, instincts from another life kicking in. He'd been a soldier once, and he knew the look of trouble before it ever reached the gate. He set his cup down slowly and stepped off the porch, his boots crunching the gravel as he watched the trucks roll closer. When they stopped, the silence broke. Doors opened. Men stepped out, not locals, not neighbors. They were dressed in sharp clothes, gold chains catching the moonlight. The kind of men who didn't belong in a quiet place like this. And at the center of them stood one man in a floral shirt, calm and smiling like he owned the world. Marcus didn't say a word. He just stood there, his arms crossed, eyes steady. "Nice place you got here," the man said, his accent thick with the edge of the borderlands. "Shame if something happened to it." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're on private land," he said. "You got about 10 seconds to turn those trucks around." The man laughed softly as if the warning was a joke. "You don't understand, my friend. You got something that belongs to us." Marcus frowned. "You got the wrong man." But deep down he knew this wasn't a mistake. The cartel had been moving further north for months. Word was they'd been buying land, forcing small ranchers out. Anyone who didn't sell ended up missing. Marcus had heard the stories, but he never thought they'd come knocking at his door. The man in the floral shirt snapped his fingers. The other men spread out, walking toward the barn. Marcus stepped forward, but one of them pulled out a gun, aiming low, just enough to say, "Don't move." Marcus clenched his fists. He'd faced worse before. He'd fought in sand and blood halfway across the world, but this was his home. His fight wasn't out there anymore. It was here. Then the smell of gasoline hit him. The sound of liquid splashing on wood. The strike of a match. Marcus shouted, running toward the barn, but the man with the gun stepped in his way. In seconds, the barn went up like it had been waiting to burn. Flames roared, smoke twisted into the night, and the horses screamed in panic. Marcus tried to push through, but the heat was too much. He could feel it tearing through the heart of everything he'd built. The man in the floral shirt walked up beside him, smiling through the firelight. "Next time you'll listen," he said before turning back to his trucks. Marcus fell to his knees as the barn collapsed, embers flying through the air like sparks from hell. The trucks drove off into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but ash and silence. By sunrise the ranch was gone. Marcus stood in the ashes, his hands black with soot, his heart heavier than it had ever been. He didn't cry, he never did, but his jaw tightened until it hurt. He'd lost everything before, but this time it wasn't war. It was personal. That's when he made the call. The number wasn't one you found in a phone book. It was one you kept buried for years, the kind of contact you swore you'd never use again. When the line picked up, a familiar voice came through. "Lee, it's been a long time." Marcus said nothing for a few seconds, just listening to the hum of the line. "I need a team," he finally said. 15 of the best. I'll handle the rest." There was silence on the other end, then a low whistle. "You sure you want to do this?" Marcus looked out across the land, what used to be his life, and took a slow breath. "They burned my home," he said. "Now I'm going to burn their empire." The next day, before the sun had fully risen, a black convoy rolled through the dirt road leading south. Inside were men who didn't talk much, men whose eyes had seen too many battlefields. Navy SEALs, not active duty but still dangerous, still loyal. Brothers Marcus had fought beside long ago. They didn't ask questions. They just followed him. As they crossed the state line, the radio crackled with distant chatter. News about explosions near the border, a cartel leader expanding territory, farms disappearing overnight. Marcus said nothing. He just stared ahead, his hands tight on the wheel. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one else lost what he did. And somewhere beyond those hills, behind the smoke and gunmetal skies, The man in the floral shirt was waiting, confident, untouchable, unaware that the storm coming for him wasn't just one man. It was 15 ghosts trained to end wars before they start. The road stretched on, endless and silent. The desert wind carried the smell of dust and danger. Marcus's reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, tired, hard, unbroken. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer. This time they picked the wrong man. The engines roared louder as the convoy disappeared into the southern horizon. What came next would change everything. But that's where the Real story begins. The sun was just starting to climb over the horizon when Marcus and the team reached the edge of the desert. The convoy stopped near an old gas station that looked abandoned for years. The paint had peeled off the walls and the signs swung loosely in the wind. Dust covered everything. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one stayed long enough to find answers. Marcus stepped out first, stretching his shoulders, the heat already pressing down even though it was barely morning. The men that followed him moved with quiet purpose. Each of them had a story, scars that didn't show on their faces. There was Cole, the calm sniper with eyes like steel. Ramirez, the joker of the group who somehow could still laugh even in places like this. And Tom Bear Hensley, a giant of a man who'd been with Marcus since the early days. These weren't just soldiers, they were brothers. And though years had passed since their last mission together, the bond between them hadn't faded. "Still can't believe you called us, Lee," Bear said, leaning against a truck, wiping sweat from his neck. "Thought you swore off this life." Marcus nodded slowly, staring out at the desert. "I did. But sometimes life doesn't care what you swore." Cole looked up from checking his rifle. "You sure this is just about the ranch?" he asked quietly. "Feels like there's more to it." Marcus didn't answer right away. He took a long breath, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sand met the sky. "They didn't just burn land," he said. "They burned my family's history. My father built that ranch with his hands. My mother planted every tree. That place was all I had left of them. I won't let that stand." Ramirez shook his head with a half-smile. "Man, you could have just called the cops." Marcus gave a small grin. "You ever seen the cops handle a cartel?" The joke faded quickly, replaced by silence. They all knew what they were walking into. The cartel wasn't just one man, it was a network built on fear and silence. The man in the floral shirt, the one who ordered the fire, wasn't the kind of person you could find easily. He hid behind layers of power, money, and men who did his dirty work. Marcus knew they needed more than muscle. They needed information. He pulled out a folded map from his bag, spreading it across the hood of the truck. "We start here," he said, pointing to a small town just across the border. "A man named Javier runs the trucking routes for the cartel. He'll know who gave the order." Cole studied the map. "And how do we get him to talk?" Marcus looked up. "We don't force him. We make him remember who he used to be. He used to be one of us, a Marine." That caught the team's attention. A Marine working for a cartel? It wasn't new, but it still hit differently. Sometimes men came back from war and never found peace. Marcus understood that more than anyone. The drive south took most of the day. As they crossed into Mexico, the air grew heavier, filled with dust and heat. The roads became narrower, lined with small shops and children playing soccer in the dirt. Every so often they'd pass trucks with tinted windows, men watching from the shade. The kind of silent warning that said, "You don't belong here." Marcus's mind wandered as the miles rolled on. He thought of his father teaching him how to ride horses, his mother's laughter when the rain came after long summers, the smell of the barn before it burned. Every memory felt sharper now, like each one was a reason to keep moving. As night approached, they reached the outskirts of the small town marked on the map. A row of houses sat under dim streetlights, and in the distance, the faint hum of a radio drifted through the air. They parked a few blocks away, keeping their distance. Marcus and Cole went ahead on foot, moving quietly through the shadows until they reached a small bar with cracked windows. Inside, the music was low and slow. A handful of men sat at tables playing cards or drinking. The bartender glanced up when Marcus entered but said nothing. Javier was easy to spot. He sat alone in the corner, his head shaved, arms covered in tattoos that told more stories than he ever would. His eyes lifted when he saw Marcus. For a second, confusion crossed his face, then recognition. "Lee," he said, voice low. "You're supposed to be done with this life." Marcus took a seat across from him. "So were you." Javier looked around, uneasy. "You shouldn't be here." "I wouldn't be," Marcus said, "if your new friends hadn't burned down my ranch." The words hit like a hammer. Javier froze, his jaw tightening. "That wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. It's getting out of hand. Marcus leaned forward. Then tell me who's running it. Who gave the order? Javier hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his drink. You don't understand. They've changed, Lee. It's not just one boss anymore. It's bigger, money, politics, everything. You can't touch them. Marcus's voice stayed calm. You know me. I'm not here to touch them. I'm here to end this. The air between them grew heavy. Javier's eyes darted toward the door. You didn't hear this from me, he said finally. The man you're looking for, he calls himself El Gallo. The Rooster. He runs everything from a compound 2 hours south of here. You won't get close without being seen. Marcus nodded slowly. We'll see about that. Before he could say more, the sound of engines echoed outside. Javier's expression changed instantly. You brought them here? He whispered harshly. Marcus turned toward the window. Headlights. Trucks. The same kind of convoy that had come to his ranch. Get out the back, Javier said quickly. Now. Marcus and Cole slipped out just as the doors burst open at the front. Men poured in, shouting, their boots thudding against the floor. Outside, the rest of the team was already moving. They didn't engage. They vanished into the night, the way soldiers learn to do when the odds aren't fair. They regrouped in the hills outside town, breathing hard, sweat and dust mixing on their faces. Marcus looked back toward the faint lights of the town below. They knew we were coming, Cole said quietly. Marcus nodded. Which means we're getting close. The others didn't ask what happened inside. They trusted him enough to know it was bad and enough to know it wasn't over. As the desert wind picked up, Marcus pulled the map from his pocket again. The ink smudged under his thumb where El Gallo's name had been marked. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Ramirez broke the silence. So what's the move? Marcus looked up at the team, the firelight from their small camp flickering in his eyes. We don't rush in, he said. We watch. We learn. Then we make sure no one else loses their home because of him. Cole nodded slowly. And if we get caught? Marcus's voice was steady, cold but human. Then we finish what we started. The night stretched on, stars scattered across the sky like quiet witnesses. Somewhere out there, a man in a floral shirt slept peacefully, believing the fire had ended a story. But for Marcus and his brothers, it had only just begun. And when the morning came, the desert would carry the sound of engines once more, rolling south, deeper into danger, deeper into the kind of fight none of them could walk away from. The past had come calling, and this time Marcus Lee was ready to answer. The next morning came with a heavy stillness. The desert stretched out like a faded memory, and the sky burned orange at the edges. Marcus sat by the dying campfire, staring into the embers, his thoughts running in circles. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The night's encounter made one thing clear. The cartel knew they were coming. Someone was feeding them information. Bear walked over holding 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to Marcus, then sat beside him. You're thinking it was Javier? Marcus shook his head slowly. No. Javier was scared. He didn't set us up. But someone else knew we'd talk to him. Cole joined them, rubbing the back of his neck. We're being watched, he said. I saw movement on the ridge before dawn. They're keeping distance, but they're there. Ramirez kicked the dirt nearby, frustration showing on his face. Then what's the plan? We can't move blind. Marcus looked up, eyes sharp but calm. We won't move blind. We'll draw them out. They packed up quickly and split the convoy, leaving one truck in plain sight and the rest hidden behind an outcrop of rocks. Cole set up with his scope on the ridge while Marcus and Bear stayed near the decoy truck. The sun rose higher, and the heat became a wall pressing down on them. Hours passed with nothing but the buzz of flies and the dry whisper of the wind. Then, finally, a shimmer of movement on the horizon. A small motorcycle kicked up dust as it approached, carrying a young man. He looked barely 20, wearing a worn jacket and a baseball cap. When he got close enough, Marcus stepped out. The kid froze, startled. You're a long way from town, Marcus said. The kid hesitated, eyes darting around. You Marcus Lee? Marcus didn't answer. Who's asking? I got a message, the kid said quickly, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. From someone who says you're making a mistake. Marcus took the paper carefully. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. It read, go back north. You're fighting ghosts. The man you want isn't who you think he is. He looked up, but the kid had already turned his motorcycle around, speeding off into the heat haze. Bear frowned. You think that was a warning or a threat? Marcus folded the note, sliding it into his pocket. Doesn't matter. Either way, they know my name. They regrouped later that day at an abandoned farmhouse deep in the desert. It was half collapsed, but it gave them cover. Inside, dust floated in the light cutting through the broken windows. Cole laid out satellite photos on the table, grainy images of a compound surrounded by fencing and guard towers. "This is it," he said, pointing to the center. "El Gallo's base. Security's tight. Cameras, patrols, everything you'd expect." Ramirez leaned over the table. "Looks like a fortress." Marcus studied the photo. The compound sat at the edge of a small village. Beyond it was a mountain range, and beneath that, a river that snaked across the land. "We won't go through the front," Marcus said. "We'll use the riverbed." "They won't expect that." Bear grunted. "That riverbed's dry. You're talking about hiking for miles through open terrain." Marcus nodded. "That's why we move at night." The room fell quiet again. Plans were being made, but something still felt off. Cole noticed it too. "You don't trust the map," he said. Marcus looked at him. "I don't trust anything that's too easy." As the sun dropped, they took turns resting. Marcus walked outside, the evening air cooling the sand. He could see the faint glow of the village lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, the man in the floral shirt, El Gallo, was living comfortably, surrounded by power and fear. Marcus thought about the faces of the men who'd come to his ranch, about how sure they were that no one would come after them. He wondered if El Gallo even remembered that night. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. It was Cole. "You okay?" Marcus gave a half-smile. "As okay as a man can be after losing everything." Cole nodded. "You ever think about what happens after this? If we make it out?" Marcus didn't look at him. "Haven't thought that far. This isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You're still trying to fix things, huh? Even after all this time?" Marcus chuckled lightly. "Guess it's the only thing I know how to do." They stood there in silence, listening to the desert. In the distance, a coyote howled long and low. It reminded Marcus that this land didn't belong to anyone, it just outlasted whoever tried to claim it. Later that night they moved out. The moon was thin, the stars bright enough to light their path. They followed the dry riverbed south, keeping low, their gear muffled. The silence was tense but focused. Every sound, every crunch of sand, every whisper of wind, felt like it meant something. After an hour, Ramirez stopped suddenly, raising his hand. They froze. Ahead, a figure stood near the bend of the river. The silhouette was still waiting. Marcus motioned for the team to spread out, then approached slowly. When he got close enough, he saw that it wasn't one of theirs. It was a woman, hands raised, her face tired but calm. "I'm not here to fight," she said softly. Marcus studied her. "Then why are you here?" "I came to warn you," she replied. "They know your plan. There's someone in your group feeding them information." Her words hit like a bullet. The others exchanged tense looks. Cole stepped forward. "Who told you that?" She hesitated. "My brother works for El Gallo. He heard your name. Said they've been tracking you since Texas." Marcus's voice dropped. "Why tell us?" "Because my brother doesn't want to see more blood," she said. "You think El Gallo runs everything, but there's someone above him. Someone who wants you dead before you reach the border." Marcus frowned. "Who?" But the woman shook her head. "I don't know his name. Only that he's not from here. American. Former military." The silence that followed was sharp. Bear muttered under his breath. "That doesn't make sense. Why would one of ours work with them?" Marcus didn't answer. But inside, a storm was building. He knew too well how easily good men could get lost after war. Money, power, purpose, it could twist anyone. The woman looked back toward the hills. "If you keep going, you won't make it past the next village. They're waiting for you there." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we'll find another way." Before she left, she turned back. "Be careful who you trust, Marcus Lee." When she was gone, the team gathered close. The tension was heavy now, thick enough to feel. Ramirez whispered, "You think she's lying?" Marcus looked at each of them. "Doesn't matter. We move like she's right." No one spoke after that. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain that would never come. Somewhere far off, lightning flickered across the horizon, silent and distant. Marcus glanced back at his men, the only family he had left. Someone among them might be the reason the cartel always knew where they were. But until he found out who, he had no choice but to keep moving forward. He adjusted the strap on his pack, eyes fixed on the dark stretch ahead. "We move before dawn," he said quietly. "The river leads south. Follow it, no noise." As the others began to pack up, Marcus stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of the desert pressing in on him. The flames that took his ranch had started something bigger than he'd imagined. And now, the line between enemy and brother was starting to blur. He didn't know who to trust. But one thing was certain, the fight was far from over. And somewhere beyond that dry horizon, the truth waited, buried deep in the dust. The wind cut through the canyon that night like a whisper carrying secrets. Marcus led the team along the narrow riverbed, the ground crunching under their boots, every step calculated and quiet. The moon hung low, its pale light stretching over the rocks like a silver thread. No one spoke. Every man was lost in his own thoughts, caught between fear and determination. They had been moving for hours, the desert stretching endlessly ahead of them, when Cole's voice came softly over the comms. Movement at 2 o'clock. Could be a patrol. Marcus froze, raising his fist to halt the group. They crouched low behind a ridge. In the distance, faint lights flickered, trucks moving slowly across the sand. The cartel's patrols. The engines were muffled, their searchlights sweeping lazily across the terrain. "Stay low," Marcus whispered. "Let them pass." They waited, unmoving as the convoy crept closer. The lights brushed over the rocks, then faded into the darkness. Only when the engines became a dull hum again did Marcus signal them forward. Every muscle in his body stayed tense, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to. By dawn, the dry riverbed opened into a narrow valley. Ahead, hidden among the cliffs, was the outline of Al Gallo's compound, high walls, watchtowers, and steel gates. It looked less like a house and more like a fortress. Smoke rose from inside, and faint music echoed in the distance. They set up camp in a cave overlooking the valley. Cole unpacked his scope and scanned the perimeter. Heavily armed. "Cameras on every wall," he murmured. "That's no ranch, that's a military outpost." Bear grunted. "He's expecting trouble." Marcus stood near the edge of the cave, watching the compound in silence. His jaw was tight, his mind running through every possible approach. He'd seen setups like this before in places far from home, places where men thought walls could save them from what they'd done. Ramirez broke the silence. "So what's the play? We can't just walk through those gates." Marcus turned slowly. "We won't. We'll find the weak point. Every man who thinks he's untouchable has won." He turned to Cole. "Give me a layout of the guard shifts. I want to know how often those towers rotate. We hit them when they least expect it." Cole nodded, already adjusting his lens. While the others worked, Marcus walked deeper into the cave alone. He pulled the note from his pocket, the one that said he was fighting ghosts. He read it again, over and over, trying to find something new between the lines. Every word felt heavier now. The woman's warning about a traitor echoed in his head. When he returned, Bear was waiting for him near the entrance. "You're thinking too loud," he said with a half-smile. Marcus didn't laugh. "Someone's feeding them intel, Bear. We can't ignore that." Bear's smile faded. "You think it's one of us?" "I don't want to," Marcus said quietly. "But every time we move, they're already there. That's not luck. That's precision." They both looked back toward the others. Cole was still busy marking the compound map. Ramirez sat cleaning his rifle, humming quietly under his breath. None of them looked suspicious, and that made it worse. That night, the tension was thick enough to taste. No one said much. Even Ramirez had stopped joking. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of a small fire hidden deep inside the cave. Outside, the desert stretched like an ocean of shadows. Marcus waited until everyone was asleep before stepping out. The air was cold, biting at his skin. He climbed the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the compound lights blink in the distance. Somewhere in that maze of walls was the man who'd taken everything from him. Somewhere down there was El Gallo, and maybe the truth. He heard a faint crunch behind him. Instinctively he turned, his hand going to his sidearm, but it was Cole. "Couldn't sleep?" Cole asked, stepping beside him. Marcus relaxed slightly. "Something like that." Cole followed his gaze to the compound. "You ever wonder if revenge really fixes anything?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't," he said finally. "But it makes sure they don't hurt anyone else." Cole nodded slowly. "You sound like a man trying to convince himself." Marcus gave a faint smile. "Maybe I am." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was the kind that made you realize how fragile everything was. Then Cole said something that made Marcus's heart pause. "You know," he said quietly, "if someone was feeding them info, it'd have to be someone who knows tactics. Someone who understands how you move, how you think." Marcus turned toward him. "You trying to say something, Cole?" Cole met his eyes. "Just saying you've been predictable." You're still playing soldier in a world that doesn't follow those rules anymore. Marcus didn't respond. But as Cole walked back down toward the cave, something cold settled in his chest. The next day they moved closer. Cole had mapped the guard rotations and a plan was forming. They would breach through a drainage tunnel near the riverbed that led under the east wall. It was risky, narrow, dark, and possibly trapped, but it was the only path that gave them a chance. Before they moved out, Marcus checked their gear one by one. When he got to Cole, he noticed a small transmitter clipped to the side of his pack, one that wasn't standard issue. "What's this?" Marcus asked. Cole froze. "Tracker," he said quickly. "For coordination." Marcus's tone sharpened. "I didn't authorize it." Cole's jaw tightened. "Relax, Lee. It's just for location tracking if we get split." But Marcus's instincts were screaming. He reached out, snatched the device and crushed it under his boot. We moved silent. No signals. For a second the two men locked eyes, the kind of look where words didn't matter anymore. The air between them was heavy, charged with something dangerous. Ramirez broke the moment with a low whistle. "You two done? We've got work to do." Marcus turned away first. "Let's move." The team made their way to the drainage tunnel under the cover of night. The air was thick with tension, every man watching his step, every sound amplified in the silence. The tunnel entrance was small, hidden behind brush and rock. Bear went first, crouching low and sliding in. One by one they followed, Marcus taking the rear. Inside, the tunnel smelled of rust and earth. Water dripped from the ceiling. They moved slowly, flashlights off, relying only on faint moonlight that filtered through cracks above. Halfway through, Cole whispered, "We've got company." Marcus looked up. Faint footsteps echoed from somewhere behind them, more than one set. He motioned for silence, but the footsteps were getting closer. Too close. "Keep moving," Marcus hissed. "Now." They quickened their pace, but just as they reached the end of the tunnel, a flash of light burst behind them. Gunfire cracked in the distance, controlled, precise. Marcus turned back, heart pounding. Cole was gone. "Go!" Marcus shouted, pushing Ramirez forward. Bear grabbed his arm, dragging him out into the open as bullets tore through the tunnel walls. They rolled behind a stone wall, panting. "Where's Cole?" Bear yelled. Marcus looked back toward the darkness. There was no sign of him, just the faint echo of footsteps fading away. And then from the compound, alarms started to wail. Floodlights snapped on, cutting through the night like blades. Guards poured out, shouting commands in Spanish. The valley exploded into chaos. Marcus looked down at the crushed transmitter pieces still in his pocket. His stomach sank as realization hit him. The signal wasn't broken after all. Someone had been tracking them from the inside. Bear met his eyes. "What now?" Marcus drew a slow breath, eyes fixed on the blazing compound ahead. "We finished this," he said. "No more running." The roar of engines and shouts echoed across the valley as the team scattered for cover. The desert had gone from silent to storm in seconds. Somewhere in that chaos, Marcus knew the answers waited. Who betrayed them? Why his ranch was burned? And who really pulled the strings behind El Gallo's empire? The fire was coming full circle now, and Marcus Lee was standing right at the edge of it. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was close. Very close. The alarms from the compound echoed through the valley like a warning to the entire desert. Red lights flashed against the rocky cliffs, cutting through the dust and darkness. Marcus pressed his back against the wall, breathing hard as the sounds of shouting grew louder. The heat from the spotlights made the air shimmer, and the ground vibrated under the roar of approaching vehicles. Bear crouched beside him, sweat streaking through the dirt on his face. "They're sweeping the valley," he said, voice low but steady. "We've got minutes before they surround us." Marcus scanned the area, his mind racing. The broken transmitter pieces still lay in his palm. They'd been careful. Too careful. Yet the cartel had found them again. It couldn't just be Cole, not this fast, not this exact. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone outside their circle. He looked across the valley where the compound walls glowed under floodlights. The night felt charged, alive, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. "Bear," Marcus said quietly, "we split up. You and Ramirez move east and draw their attention. I'll go after Cole." Bear frowned. "You think he flipped?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I don't know. But he's not where he should be. That's enough for now." Without waiting for a response, Marcus moved, staying low as he slipped along the ridge. The dust rose around his boots with every step. The noise of gunfire faded behind him, replaced by the steady hum of generators and the crackle of radio chatter. Near the base of the compound, he found a narrow service tunnel partially hidden by crates. The entrance was unguarded, which only made it more suspicious. He hesitated, listening. Nothing. Then he slipped inside. The tunnel was cramped and smelled like metal and oil. Faint light flickered from bulbs along the ceiling, and somewhere in the distance, he heard faint voices. He followed the sound until it led him to a small control room. Inside, 2 cartel guards were hunched over a monitor showing live drone feeds of the valley, his team's position marked clearly in red. Marcus stepped closer, silent as a shadow. He grabbed a wrench from the table and brought it down with precision. The guards went still and the room fell quiet again. He looked at the monitors, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Every movement from his team had been tracked in real time. Then, on one of the screens, he saw something that made his stomach turn. A feed from a satellite drone, not cartel equipment. The overlay at the bottom corner read, "Property of Sentinel Security Group." Marcus froze. Sentinel wasn't cartel. Sentinel was American. He leaned closer, flipping through the other camera feeds. Most of them showed standard surveillance, but one feed, labeled Op Overseer, was different. It showed a man sitting in a well-lit office, watching the same images Marcus was seeing. The man leaned forward, face half in shadow, but Marcus recognized him instantly. It was Commander Ross, his former commanding officer from their Navy days. For a moment everything stopped. The air, the sound, even his heartbeat. It didn't make sense. Ross had retired years ago. He was supposed to be running private contracts overseas, not sitting behind cartel surveillance halfway across the border. Then it hit him. The cartel wasn't just a gang. It was a front. A business being fed by American weapons, trained by private contractors. And Ross, the man who once led them through battle, was now pulling those strings. The rage hit him like fire, but he forced himself to stay calm. He grabbed one of the guards' radios and tuned it to their channel. Static crackled, then a voice came through, one he hadn't heard in years. "Marcus," Ross said, his tone smooth, almost casual. "You shouldn't have come here." Marcus clenched his jaw. "You burned my ranch, Ross. You killed everything I had left." There was a short laugh on the other end. "Collateral damage. You got in the way of something bigger. This isn't personal." "Everything's personal," Marcus said quietly. Ross sighed. "You always were the stubborn one. Still think the world runs on right and wrong. It doesn't. It runs on control. The cartel, the land, it's all about leverage. You could have been part of it. But now you're just another problem to fix." Marcus's hand tightened around the radio. "You trained me better than to be someone's pawn." "Then prove it," Ross said, and the line went dead. Before Marcus could react, the screens flickered and the compound lights shut off. Total darkness swallowed the valley. The silence that followed was worse than the alarms. He heard a faint click. Then the whole tunnel shook as an explosion erupted outside. He stumbled back, the dust choking the air. Through the echo of collapsing metal, he caught sight of movement at the far end of the corridor. "Cole." Marcus raised his voice, rough and raw. "Cole. Stop." Cole turned, flashlight glinting off his face. "You weren't supposed to come here yet," he said. "Ross told me to lead you in after dawn." Marcus took a step forward. "You sold us out?" Cole's eyes were hollow, his voice low. "You think any of this matters? We fought for years for a country that forgot us. Ross gave me a way out. A purpose. By burning my home?" Marcus snapped. Cole's expression faltered. "That wasn't supposed to happen. They were just supposed to scare you off. It got out of hand." Marcus's chest tightened, fury and disbelief twisting inside him. "You watched it burn." Cole looked down. "You don't understand, Lee. Ross isn't working for them, they're working for him. He's building something bigger than the cartel. A network that controls everything from the inside." Before Marcus could say another word, shouts echoed from behind. Guards were closing in. Cole looked torn for a moment, then threw a small data drive across the floor. "You'll need this. Proof of everything. But you won't get far if you stay." Marcus caught it and started to say something, but Cole was already turning back toward the approaching guards. "Go," he shouted. The gunfire that followed filled the tunnel, deafening and bright. Marcus ran, the heat of the blasts burning against his back. He didn't look back. He couldn't. When he reached the outside, the valley was chaos. Fires burning, the compound half in ruins, vehicles overturned. Bear and Ramirez were pinned behind cover, returning fire. Marcus dove beside them, breathless. "We've got bigger problems," he said, holding up the data drive. "Ross is behind this. He's running the cartel. Bear stared at him, disbelief cutting through the noise. Ross? Our Ross. Marcus nodded. And Cole's gone. Before Bear could respond, the ground trembled again, not from gunfire this time but from engines. Dozens of vehicles were cresting the ridge, headlights flooding the valley. Marcus looked up, heart pounding. The cartel wasn't retreating, they were reinforcing. The sky glowed red from the fires below, and the smoke turned the stars into a blur. Ramirez shouted over the noise. We can't hold this position. Marcus looked at the compound, at the dark tunnel where Cole had vanished, and then at the drive in his hand. Whatever was on it, it was the key, not just to the cartel but to everything behind it. He took a deep breath, steady and focused. We don't hold, he said. We move. We take the fight to Ross himself. As they sprinted toward the mountains, gunfire lighting the night behind them, Marcus knew this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something even darker. The fire that started on his ranch had spread far beyond what he ever imagined. And now the real war was about to begin. The wind screamed across the desert as dawn broke over the mountains, washing the sky in shades of red and gray. The convoy moved fast through the narrow trails, tires grinding against the rock and sand. Marcus sat behind the wheel, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the road ahead. His team was silent. They all knew what was coming, one last fight, one final reckoning. They had traced the signal from the drive Cole had given him. It led deep into Sonora, to an old airstrip once used for military training. Now it was Ross's base, hidden behind layers of fences, guards and cameras. From above it looked abandoned. From the ground it was something else entirely. Bear's voice came through the radio. Visual on the compound. 2 clicks out. Heat signatures all over. Marcus nodded. We go quiet. Once we breach, no turning back. They parked the vehicles under a ridge and checked their gear. The desert heat was already rising, burning against the back of their necks. Marcus looked over his team, men who had followed him through more chaos than most could imagine. Men who had nothing to gain but a sense of justice. Ross took everything from us, Marcus said quietly. This ends today. They moved in through the dry brush, keeping low as the sound of rotors filled the distance. A helicopter sat on the far end of the strip, its blades turning lazily, waiting. Marcus could see figures moving around it, one of them tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably Ross. The memory of his ranch burning flashed in his mind. The smell of smoke. The silence after. He pushed it down, focusing on the mission. They slipped past the outer fence and took cover behind a hangar. Bear planted a small device on the side panel and gave Marcus a nod. The door slid open with a faint creak. Inside, computers lined the walls, screens filled with maps and coordinates, supply routes, financial transactions, satellite links. The data from the drive matched everything here. Ramirez started copying the files while Marcus scanned the screens. One feed showed a live video, his ranch. The land had been rebuilt, fenced off, marked with the Sentinel logo. It wasn't just a random attack. Ross had used it as a test site for something bigger. Before he could react, a voice echoed through the hangar. You were always predictable, Marcus. They turned. Ross stood at the doorway, calm and composed, flanked by 2 guards in dark tactical gear. His hair was grayer now, but the same cold sharpness burned in his eyes. You never learned when to walk away, Ross said, stepping forward. You could have joined me. We could have built something powerful. Marcus didn't answer. He looked around, the monitors, the soldiers, the helicopter waiting outside. Everything Ross had built stood right here. You trained us to protect, Marcus said. Not to sell out lives for profit. Ross smirked. Protecting isn't profitable. Controlling is. Bear shifted beside Marcus, ready to move, but Marcus lifted a hand, a silent signal to wait. You burned my home, Marcus said quietly. Ross tilted his head. Collateral. You think you were the first man to lose something for a cause. Marcus stepped closer. You forgot what the cause was. For a heartbeat, the air hung still between them. Then a sound cracked from outside, the whine of engines. Bear turned toward the window. We've got movement. Ross smiled. You didn't think I came alone, did you? Vehicles poured into the airstrip, headlights slicing through the dust. The team scattered for cover as bullets tore into the walls. Marcus dove behind a crate, pulling Ramirez down with him. Bear returned fire, keeping the guards pinned. Ramirez, get that data out. Marcus shouted. Ramirez slammed a drive into his vest pocket and crawled toward the rear exit. Marcus looked up just in time to see Ross moving toward the helicopter. He sprinted after him, weaving through smoke and sparks. The helicopter's blades were spinning faster now, kicking up sand. Ross climbed aboard, shouting orders to the pilot. Marcus leapt onto the landing skid just as the chopper began to lift. He held on tight, the wind tearing at his face. Ross turned, surprise flashing across his features. "You just don't quit, do you?" he shouted over the noise. Marcus pulled himself inside, the cabin shaking violently. The two men faced each other, teacher and student, soldier and survivor. Ross reached for his weapon, but Marcus was faster. He knocked it aside, the two men grappling as the helicopter lurched. The ground spun below them. For a moment, the fight wasn't about revenge or orders. It was about everything that had led here, the betrayal, the fire, the years of loyalty turned to ash. Ross swung hard, catching Marcus in the ribs. Marcus staggered but didn't fall. He lunged forward, grabbing Ross by the vest. The chopper pitched, alarms blaring. "You destroyed everything I stood for," Marcus said through gritted teeth. Ross's face twisted. "You stood for nothing. You just never had the guts to admit it." The pilot yelled something in panic, but before anyone could react, Marcus slammed Ross against the console. Sparks flew as the controls shorted out. The helicopter spun, the desert rushing up beneath them. Marcus yanked the emergency lever, forcing the side door open. The air roared around them. He looked Ross dead in the eyes. "You forgot one thing, Commander," he said. "You taught me how to survive." He kicked off, leaping into the open air just as the helicopter lost control and spiraled down. The explosion shook the ground, fire lighting up the horizon. Marcus hit the sand hard, rolling through dust and debris. His ears rang, the world a blur of heat and noise. When he finally looked up, the wreckage was burning in the distance, flames licking at the morning sky. Bear and Ramirez ran toward him from the ridge, both covered in dust and sweat. "You alive?" Bear shouted. Marcus nodded weakly, pushing himself up. "Yeah," he rasped. "Barely." They helped him to his feet. Behind them, the rest of the team was regrouping, gathering what was left of their supplies. The compound was gone, the data secured, and Ross's operation in ruins. As the sun climbed higher, the desert seemed almost peaceful again. The airstrip was silent except for the crackle of fading flames. Ramirez handed Marcus the small data drive. "Whatever's on this," he said, "it's enough to expose everything, the cartel, Sentinel, all of it." Marcus turned the drive over in his hand, its metal surface catching the light. "Then we make it count," he said. But just as they started back toward the trucks, a faint sound buzzed from Marcus's radio, a voice distorted but clear enough to recognize. "Marcus," it said. "You really think Ross was the only one?" The team froze. Marcus stared at the radio, the words sinking in. The voice wasn't Ross's. It was someone else, calm, steady, familiar. It was Cole. Static filled the line, then silence. Marcus looked out toward the horizon where the mountains met the sky. For the first time he realized the fire they'd put out was just one of many. The wind carried the smell of smoke and dust, and in that moment he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. He slipped the drive into his pocket, the sun glaring against his face. "Let's go," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." The engines roared to life, kicking up clouds of sand as they drove away, leaving behind the wreckage, the ashes, and the beginning of something far bigger waiting beyond the border. And somewhere in the distance, another storm was already rising. The desert stretched endlessly as the convoy rolled north, the morning sun turning the sand into gold. The wind was calmer now, carrying only the sound of engines and the faint hum of peace that always follows a storm. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. His reflection in the glass looked older, wearier, but his eyes still carried that same steady fire, the kind that refused to die no matter how much the world tried to put it out. Bear drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, his arm wrapped in a bandage. Ramirez followed close behind with the rest of the team, their trucks coated in dust and battle scars. No one spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. The fight was over, at least this one. But in the quiet between the miles, every man was turning over his own thoughts, wondering what came next. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out the data drive. The small piece of metal felt heavier than it should have. Inside it was proof, enough to expose Sentinel, the cartel connections, Ross's hidden network, everything they'd uncovered. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about stopping something that had rooted itself deeper than any one man. Bear glanced at him. "You really think the world's gonna care?" Marcus looked at the horizon, the faint line where the sky met the earth. "Maybe not," he said. "But somebody has to tell the truth. That's how it starts." They drove until the mountains began to fade and the landscape turned greener. A small border town came into view, quiet, peaceful, almost too normal after what they'd seen. Kids played in the streets, a man sold fruit by the roadside, and an old dog lay under a truck for shade. For a moment, it felt like another world. They parked behind a gas station where a small satellite dish stood behind the fence. Ramirez hooked up a laptop connecting the drive. The screen filled with lines of code, maps and documents, years of hidden operations tied to names, companies and accounts. It was bigger than any of them thought. The network reached into banks, politics, even law enforcement. "This isn't just the cartel," Ramirez muttered. "This is a whole machine." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we take it apart piece by piece." Bear sighed, lighting a cigarette. "You know, most people would just walk away after something like this." "Maybe," Marcus said, watching the smoke drift into the air. "But walking away never fixed anything." They uploaded the data to several encrypted servers, sending copies to journalists, officials, and international watchdogs. It was risky, but there was no other way. Once the files were out, there would be no taking them back. When the upload finished, Ramirez shut the laptop with a quiet click. "That's it. It's done." Marcus leaned back against the truck, closing his eyes for a moment. The weight he'd carried since the night his ranch burned began to lift, just a little. The fight had taken everything, his home, his peace, and some of his brothers, but it had also given him something back: purpose. Later that afternoon, they sat at a small roadside diner, eating in silence. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. A news report played faintly on the old TV above the counter. The reporter spoke about a leak exposing a criminal network with ties to a private defense contractor. There were images of men being taken into custody, accounts frozen, offices raided. It was spreading fast. Bear grinned faintly. "Guess they finally noticed." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Took them long enough." As they left the diner, Marcus noticed an old newspaper machine outside. On the front page there was a story about a small Texas ranch being rebuilt by volunteers. People who wanted to restore what had been lost. The headline read, "Community rises from the ashes." He stood there for a while just looking at it. The photograph wasn't his ranch, but it felt like it could have been. The same soil, the same kind of hope. Bear came up beside him. "You thinking about going back?" Marcus folded the paper under his arm. "Maybe one day." "Not yet." They walked back to the trucks, the sun dipping low behind them. Ramirez was checking the gear when the radio crackled again, that same faint static as before. Everyone froze. Then a voice came through, calm and familiar. "You did good work, Marcus." It was Cole. Marcus lifted the radio slowly. "Where are you?" A small pause, then, out of sight. "Ross wasn't the only one building something. I've got people who want the same thing you do, to take down what's left of Sentinel. But we can't do it alone." Marcus exchanged glances with Bear. "You disappeared back there. You could have warned us." "I had to make it look real," Cole replied. "If I hadn't, you'd all be dead by now." The explosion wasn't the end. They're regrouping under new names. The world thinks it's over, but it's not. Marcus took a deep breath. "Then I guess we're not done either." Cole's voice softened. "You ever think maybe we were never meant to stop fighting?" Marcus looked out over the fading sunlight. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we stop living." The radio went silent after that. Marcus clipped it back onto his vest and climbed into the truck. The others followed without a word. As they drove north, the road wound through valleys and open plains. The light turned golden, stretching long shadows across the ground. It was quiet, not the kind of silence that came from fear, but the kind that follows when a man finally finds peace in what he's done. Bear leaned out the window, letting the wind hit his face. "You ever think about what's next?" Marcus smiled faintly. "A new start. Maybe somewhere green this time." "Think you'll ever rebuild?" He thought about it, the porch, the barn, the horses, the quiet nights under the stars. "Yeah," he said finally. "But not for me. For the next kid who thinks the world can't be fixed. Someone's gotta show him it can." They crossed back into Texas as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The first stars began to appear one by one. The land felt familiar again, though different somehow, like it had been cleansed by everything they'd been through. When they reached the old highway, Marcus pulled over and stepped out. The air was cool, the kind that carried a hint of rain. He stood there for a while, looking up at the stars, the soft rumble of the engine behind him. Bear came up beside him. "You know, we could just disappear now. No one would blame us." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, we could. But then the next guy like Ross would just keep going." He looked back at the horizon where the last light still lingered. We finish what we start. Bear clapped him on the shoulder. Then let's get to work. They climbed back in, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the truck rumbled down the empty road. The radio was quiet now, no more static, no more ghosts. Just the hum of the road and the sound of men who'd seen too much but still chose to keep moving forward. Marcus glanced at the rearview mirror, the desert fading behind them, the open road ahead. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. The fight had cost him everything, but it had also given him clarity. Some battles weren't about winning. They were about standing up when no one else would. About reminding the world that even when it burns you down, you can rise again. The night swallowed the road ahead, endless and quiet. Marcus leaned back, eyes fixed on the stars above the windshield. "Let's go home," he said softly. And with that, the convoy disappeared into the dark horizon. Not as soldiers, not as ghosts, but as men who refused to let the fire die out, no matter how far they had to go. The desert was silent again, but this time, it wasn't holding its breath. It was resting, waiting for the next sunrise.